This is Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. The year 2023. Dr. Salla presented his research on the subject of super soldiers and ascended masters. Part 1.
So, welcome, aloha, benvenuti, g'day mates. Very glad you could join us wherever you are around the world. We are here to talk about a topic that really is intriguing to me. I mean, this is a topic that kind of goes to the roots of my own kind of like journey into this vast field of exopolitics and even before that. Now, my own interest in this really began in the 1980s. I, at that time, was kind of trying to work my way in terms of finding out, what the big question, what am I supposed to do? So 1983 was the crux moment for me. And I got interested in this issue of ascended masters. I got very interested in Indian philosophy and did a deep dive into that for well over a decade. Did meditation and those sorts of things. And, I must say my meditations were pretty mediocre. I never really got that far, never achieved any kind of savikalpa samadhi or nevikalpa samadhi, nothing as profound as that. I was just able to kind of like, experience a certain degree of stillness and calm. But, my meditations were kind of uninspiring, but nevertheless, I was very interested in this idea of ascended mastery and being able to achieve high states of consciousness through meditation and so forth. And then, of course, I began my career as a peace and conflict resolution researcher, going through university, getting all the degrees, and then getting jobs at different universities. And my journey eventually took me to this field of exopolitics, and through exopolitics, I found out all about super soldiers. So for me, it's been quite an interesting journey. And I don't think this is unique just for me. I think many of us have gone through similar journeys trying to understand what it is that we can achieve personally in terms of, whether it's prayer, meditation, or whether it's achieving some kind of peak physical performance, whether it's a sport of some kind, or, for those that are in any kind of martial arts, it's the martial arts. But I think anything physical, the principle is the same. To achieve those states of excellence where you stand above others in a way that gets noticed. So we can think of people who excel in whatever sport as a kind of that's analogous to a super soldier. So clearly, today, there are people and organizations that are very interested in how they can bring about kind of peak performance in soldiers, military personnel. As there are those that are very interested in trying to bring about a kind of peak performance in meditation states, or to achieve these elevated states of consciousness. Now, not surprisingly, this is not unique to us. We are by no means the first to do this. So what I'm going to do is kind of walk you through a little bit of the history, and the history about this topic of super soldiers and ascended masters, that can go all the way back to the Sumerians. We can go back 6,000 years in history, and we will find a very similar phenomenon back then. It involved the gods, if you like. How we know that? We know it because the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis, the Eridu Genesis, these are important texts of history according to the Sumerians and the Akkadians, which are the longest known or the earliest civilizations that contemporary historians have identified. Now, Yeah, certainly we know that there's civilizations older than that, but these are the ones where there are historical records and abundant historical records in the form of cuneiform texts or cuneiform texts. These texts, they tell us about these beginnings of humanity and when the gods, or what they call the Anunnaki, created humans. And it describes the different gods that were involved in that. So in the Enuma Elish, it clearly identifies Enki as being responsible for the creation of humanity. The term Enki just means Earth Commander. Ki is the Sumerian for Earth, and En is like the commander. So his real name is Ea, Prince Ea. So he's a royal in the royal house of the Anunnaki, and he was made responsible by the assembly of the Anunnaki. So you can read about this in the Enuma Elish. So this is historical records going back 6,000 years. It talks about this assembly of the Anunnaki saying that we want to create humans to replace the Igigi, or the Igigi, who were the Anunnaki working class that rebelled against Enlil, or Yu, who was the space commander for the Anunnaki. That the Anunnaki, they had fears of responsibility. Enlil was in charge of the space fleets, whereas Enki was in charge of Earth, running the Earth and making sure everything on the Earth ran in accordance with the Anunnaki plan. So he was responsible for creating humanity and coming up with the right genetics so that humans would perform optimally as workers for the gold mines and whatever other purposes the Anunnaki had. And Enlil was very clear that he wanted workers to replace the Igigi, and that was what the assembly agreed to. So as the lead Anunnaki geneticist, Prince Ea created the original Adamic DNA along with variations used for avatar bodies designed by the Anunnaki leaders for different purposes. So this is where it's very important to understand that it wasn't just one physical prototype, that the Anunnaki and Enki just created one physical form, the atom, like a dappa, and that was it. What, in fact, happened was that Enki created quite a number of bodies that would be used by the Anunnaki for different purposes. We would have some that would become workers, that would be intelligent enough to follow orders and just perform the chores that were assigned to them by Enki or Enlil. And others would perform other tasks that were assigned to them. Now, Enki was assisted by his sister or mother, depending on which text you consult, Ninhursag, in the genetic creation of these avatar bodies, or the different bodies that would host souls for performing these functions. Now, one of the things that was also important for the Anunnaki was to create avatar bodies for the Anunnaki themselves to transfer their soul consciousness. So it wasn't just a question of Enlil or Enki or any of their children just coming to Earth and living amongst humanity and giving orders and so forth, because the atmosphere of Earth and the gravity and the resonance field, Schumann resonance and all that, was largely incompatible with the Anunnaki body, which is much more frail. It's tall and thin and kind of frail. So what was created were different avatar bodies, different sizes. And so this is where you get the whole issue of giants. Because I think if you look back at human history, there were many giants. And I think some of these giants were created by the Anunnaki as host bodies for Anunnaki consciousness or souls to transfer themselves into, and they would then walk amongst humans as the leaders. So that way, the Anunnaki, whether it's Enlil, Enki, or someone else, Ninurta, they could safely be on their ships, on their spacecraft, go into a stasis chamber, kind of like in the movie Avatar, go into a stasis chamber, transfer their consciousness into a clone body or into a avatar body on Earth, performing them whatever duties they wanted to perform, and they had a fully functional body, and they could enjoy themselves, they could reproduce, and they could engage with humanity in whatever way they chose to. So there you have historical records showing some of these giants, ranging from the typical human down here, 6 foot, the 6 foot human. Whoa, here we go. The 6 foot human down there, and you go up, and you, like that's a 15 foot, and then you just get larger and larger bodies up until 36 feet. And of course, I've seen some that show that some of these giants are supposedly 50 feet. So there are skeletons that have been found and reported on. Of course, that's been covered up. We know that the Anunnaki, when they interacted with humans, they were physically giants, and that's represented in some of the glyphs you can find in the Sumerian records. Here, for example, you can see a glyph that shows humans there on the right, and the humans, and then you have the Anunnaki here, clearly much taller. We're probably talking 10, 12 feet, interacting with the humans. So the Anunnaki created giants, one purpose being workers that would mine the gold and whatever other precious metals the Anunnaki needed for their space fleets. Another purpose was avatar bodies for the Anunnaki who would want to come to Earth and kind of like interact with humanity. But clearly for them, it would have been advantageous to be in a giant body relative to the Earthlings, so that way they would command authority and respect. So clearly we understand why they would have done that. And also soldiers. The first super soldiers were these genetically modified giants. The Anunnaki, we know that they had many wars amongst themselves, and they used humans as proxies, and they had giants fighting on both sides. So the Anunnaki, they manufactured some of these giants to be soldiers. So these were genetically modified. Of course, that's the most famous kind of example we know in contemporary history of David and Goliath. And clearly, you have these giants that are genetically created to be soldiers, and they excelled in that art. And so we have evidence for this in the book of Enoch. And in the book of Enoch, chapter 9, or what it says is, quote, "And they, the watchers, have gone to the daughters of men upon the earth and have slept with the women, and have defiled themselves and revealed to them all kinds of sins. And the women have borne giants." So, as I said, the Anunnaki that were in these human avatar bodies that were giants, they could interact and breed with humans. And the earth has thereby been filled with blood and unrighteousness. So there it's alluding to the warfare that the giants excelled in. One of the purposes for the creation of these giants was to create these super soldiers that would excel in war. And there's evidence, more evidence for this. This was one of the hypnotherapy sessions that Dolores Cannon conducted with one of her clients, and he spoke about a past life when he was a giant, but there were others that were even bigger than him. So again, different sized giants. So he described this other race of giants that had advanced technologies and were warriors, and that they would come and kind of rape, pillage, and create mayhem amongst the ordinary human population, and how he would try to fight against those warrior giants. So let's listen to that particular clip.
Chapter 4. Different Life Forms. Land of the Giants. Jack saw himself as a very tall man named Lars with long blonde hair. His head came to half the height of the tree he was standing by. He was dressed in brown canvas pants and a shirt with puffy sleeves, with leather straps over his shoulders to hold the pants. He was wearing sandals with soles made of bark and a sheath with a sword on his back. The sword was used for protection against the people that were even larger than him. He could smell bread baking from a small cottage in the distance. There are little people that live there. They can't fend for themselves. He was bringing them a deer that he was holding in his hand, and flour. There's a young woman, and I see two small girls and a baby. I am so much larger than them, but I feel a love towards these small people. To illustrate how much bigger he was, he said the woman's head came only to his waist. There were villages of these small people, and they were in danger from beings who were larger than him. He felt an obligation to protect them. He did not live in their villages, but on the nearby mountain. I can see and overlook everything. I can overlook the valley and see if there's anything that goes wrong. He was only doing it because of a love for these small people. It was cold in this area, and people often wore fur. He lived in a structure made of rocks with his family, parents, brothers, sisters, who he also took care of. The larger people lived on an island off the coast of the big water. They came in the spring and fall in their big iron boats. These bigger people lived in darkness in large castles made of huge stones with big log doors. They were never satisfied and wanted what everyone else had. They killed everything just to kill. They had mechanical things, guns that shot fire. Their ships looked like they flew as they came across the water with no sails. He described them as having a face like a bulldog, lower extruding jaw with 2 teeth over the upper lip, a big hump on the back and very little hair. They walked slumped over. He knew what they looked like because he had wounded some of them in a battle and once in the water. He insisted he did not kill, but defended himself.
Okay, so there you have this past life memory of one giant protecting humans against even larger giants who had modern or more modern weapons, metals that they used for warfare. So there was a warrior caste of giants, and so the giants, we can see that some of the giants were specifically bred for being a warrior caste or super soldiers. Now, there are other examples, historical examples, talking about super soldiers. And probably one of the clearest is in Vedic India, where they talk about this great war. The Mahabharata is a text that talks about this great war that occurred in India roughly 4,000, 5,000 years ago, somewhere in that time frame. And here you have two opposing warriors from both sides, both of whom were bred from the sun god. So both of them had genetics that were related to the sun god, and that suggests that they were these genetically modified super soldiers. Karna and Arjuna, from the opposing factions, the Mahabharata highlights the personal battle between them in the midst of this great regional war that engulfed all of northern India at this time. And these are other examples of super soldiers, because they are described as wielding these incredible weapons, that they have these above normal or extraordinary powers that they use for warfare. And because we know that they were genetically bred, because of that sun god connection, they have these extraordinary martial abilities, and they were natural warriors. These are examples of super soldiers in Vedic India. Now, what's very interesting is that the current Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, he interprets the Mahabharata text as actually being literally a description of these super soldiers fighting against one another. So in a story that was published in the Guardian in October 2014, Narendra Modi said that when you look at the ancient Indian texts, that genetic experiments occurred thousands of years ago in Vedic India. And he's not alone in suggesting that. And this is what he said that I thought was pretty significant for the topic today. What he said was, and this is quoted in the story, quote, "We can feel proud of what our country achieved in medical science at one point of time. We all read about Karna in the Mahabharata. If we think a little more, we realize that the Mahabharata says Karna was not born from his mother's womb. This means that genetic science was present at that time. This is why Karna could be born outside of his mother's womb." So what Narendra Modi is very clearly suggesting here is that Karna was a byproduct of a genetic experiment, that he was a genetically created super soldier. That, I think, is very interesting, because what it tells us is that this issue that we face today in terms of the diverging pathways that lie before us, both individually and collectively as a planet, in terms of, do we go down the path of becoming a pool for super soldiers or a pool for kind of like ascended mastery? This was the same pathways that the ancients had to deal with, had to make choices about. So this brings us to the modern era. And in the modern era, I believe, looking at all of the literature, there are 4 types of super soldiers that are described in the literature in terms of programs, classified programs, trying to create peak human performance in soldiers using a variety of techniques. So I'm going to go through each of these different types of super soldiers, and we're going to get a good idea exactly how super soldiers are optimized humans in some way, who have been optimized through various mechanisms. So one of the mechanisms is the MK Ultra, the famous MK Ultra experiments that I'm sure many of you have heard about. So MK Ultra, these were experiments that were run by the CIA. One of the chief scientists involved with that was Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, who adopted techniques from Nazi scientists who arrived in the United States through Operation Paperclip. So the Nazis themselves had begun the very first MK Ultra mind control experiments, and they brought with them to the United States their programs, their knowledge of how to optimize human performance in soldiers. And so they came up with this MK Ultra mind control. And so that was something that was developed by the CIA and some of the intelligence community. We know that this happened because of the Church Senate committee hearings that happened in 1977. So they exposed the mind control experiments that were trauma-based. So there were a variety of ways in which this MK Ultra operated, but one of the key ways of doing it was to induce trauma in the subjects, and somehow that trauma would then lead to the splitting of the mind, where one part of the mind, a compartment of the mind, could be programmed to be anything they want. So, it could be programmed to be an assassin. Like there was a movie in the that came out, I think it was 1964, starring Frank Sinatra, called Manchurian Candidate. That was actually an expose of this MK Ultra program. So the Manchurian Candidate, when you had that splitting of the mind through these MK Ultra techniques, that person could be programmed to be an assassin or could be programmed to be a soldier that performs at an exemplary level, at a level way beyond normal human performance. So that's MK Ultra. That's not the only mind control mechanism. There's another type of mind control mechanism that was used, and this was actually called the Jedi Project. So this uses neuro-linguistic programming. It was conducted by the US Army, and there was a story in the Washington Post that appeared that was around 1983 1983, I think it was. Let's try and see the date there. 1988, that story came out. So the Pentagon's Twilight Zone. So, quote, this is what it said. In 1984, the US military launched a 5-month experiment called Project Jedi, named after the Star Wars knights who were able to use the Force to perform unusual feats, including using a weapon blindfolded. It tested the use of neuro-linguistic programming as a specific discipline developed to model human excellence. So this is not that trauma-based mind control used in MK Ultra, but it's using one of the elements of that, which is this neuro-linguistic programming, which is kind of like programming people by repeating phrases and kind of inducing a certain state of consciousness by using words in a particular way. So that doesn't need to be necessarily traumatic. It's just repetition, repetition, repetition. People learn to believe that, you know, they're a super soldier that can do whatever. So the Jedi Project actually was a real project run by the Army that started in 1984. Now, presumably, it only ran for 5 months and then it disappeared. Typically what happens in these kinds of programs is they run a feasibility study using open source scientists to kind of like find out how feasible something like this is. And when they find out that it is feasible, then it goes classified. But as far as the public is concerned, program is cancelled, nothing to see here, move along. So, but it continued secretly. So the project, the Jedi Project, using neuro-linguistic program, you can take it to the bank that continued in some way. That the Army, and I'm sure other military services, use these kinds of neuro-linguistic programs to create super soldiers. Now, mind control has at least 2 different ways in which you can create super soldiers, the MK Ultra and the neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. And so there have been witnesses that have come forward that have talked about undergoing one or both of these. So some of these super soldiers that I've come across in my research over the years, there's Michael Ralph. First heard about him in 2004. He says he went through an MK Ultra programming. Duncan O'Finian, another super soldier, was Project Camelot. Kerry Cassidy and Bill Ryan first introduced Duncan O'Finian to the public, and I got to talk to Duncan. Yeah, another super soldier. Randy Kramer, I interviewed him, and I'll actually play a clip from him, and Mark Demizio. So they are some of the people that I'll kind of like talk a little bit about now that are super soldiers that went through this mind control technique to create them by the military. So Michael Ralph, so he received MK Ultra training to enhance his psychic abilities that could be used for remote viewing, remote influencing, and psychic assassination. And he says he spent 20 years on Mars. So he says that he spent from 1976 to 1996 on Mars as this super soldier. And he was the first person to talk about a 20 and back program. That was back in 2000. That was back in the year 2000. So Michael Ralph is the first 20 and back super soldier. And his experiences were discussed in a book written by his wife, Stephanie Ralph, that's called The Mars Records. And you can go to themarsrecords.com to read about the extensive deprogramming he had to go through in terms of getting through and removing all of the MK Ultra and neuro-linguistic programming that was introduced into him. But the key here with Michael Ralph is that he had a particular talent, that he was a natural psychic, and so that was identified in him. He joined the US Navy in 1976, underwent a series of tests, and they determined that this was a guy that had a natural ability as a telepath, as a psychic, as an intuitive. And so they trained him to optimize those psychic abilities, not just for intelligence gathering, remote viewing, or remote influencing, but also psychic assassination. So that's where we get into a super soldier. So someone who clearly, by the power of mind, that can kill others, including extraterrestrials. He actually describes, it's described in the Mars records, how his psychic abilities were so developed that he could kill aliens, that he was given targets and he would do that. So that's quite extraordinary. So Michael Ralph, certainly the first super soldier I came across back in 2003 and 4 when I was first getting into this field. Randy Kramer, he was someone that also underwent mind control to become a super soldier. Now, what's interesting about Randy was that he said that the mind control that he went through was a kind of soft type of mind control, a kind of neuro-linguistic programming. And that differed from the more trauma-based mind control used by the CIA and other agencies or military services. So I actually was the first person to interview with Randy and release it publicly in 2014. When I interviewed Randy, he just used the pseudonym Captain K for reasons. At the time, he didn't want to reveal himself. He did subsequently reveal himself, but this clip that I'm going to show you has never been seen before. It is the original video I took that I only released in audio form back in 2014. So you're going to see a snippet of the video of Randy Kramer talking about the different types of mind control and how the US Marine Corps Special Section used this kind of more natural or more something that would be non-trauma based to train their super soldiers. So I'll play that now for you.
Now, there have been others who have come forward to talk about super soldier programs involving youngsters, and one of the things that was used as a control mechanism was trauma-based mind control. So right. Was that something that was also part of Project Moonshadow?
In the scope of mind control technology, my understanding is that trauma-based mind control is primitive technology when it comes to mind control and shaping technology, that there are much more sophisticated, less traumatic ways to do that, but in order to do that, you have to start younger and younger and younger. Because once you already start with someone who's got any established framework in their mind and their body, you have to break that before you can rebuild. And that's why trauma-based mind control becomes so well known and popularized, because you're working with mostly subjects which have already developed a number of years in which you have to break that down in order to rebuild. If you start from scratch, if you start from the raw DNA, you start from fertilized cells, and you start from day one, you don't have to do that as much. There are certainly some experiences in which, and my understanding was that it kind of worked like this. The ETs and Special Section of the Marine Corps were like, great, we want this program to work better than these other programs. We think doing it this way is going to be better. We think we're going to have more stable super soldiers. The question started to become, well, all this trauma-based control gives you a short lifespan. You've got a super soldier, but is only good for a short number of years before they self-destruct, or they blow up, or they internally start to cascade. So by not using the trauma-based method, you're essentially trying to give a lifespan to your super soldier much, much longer, and get many, many more years of service and use out of them than you are with a trauma-based system. So it is essentially how to be more effective, how to get more use out of. So most of what we did was not that. However, because sitting around the table, you don't have the same dozen people with the same values. The leaders of the Moonshadow program still have to sit around a table with other people who say, well, we really think we need to have some of these other safeties and controls in this system. And the argument goes around the table, well, no, that's going to mess up with our program. That's going to mess up with what we're trying to do. We're trying to not put trauma-based controls into them because we think that damages them over time. It makes them less useful and have a shorter lifespan of usefulness. But when you've got people insisting, no, 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 we have to make sure we can control this guy. We have to make sure that he doesn't get out of our hands or that he doesn't become independent, then the moon shadow leadership, rolls its eyes back and goes, fine, if you're going to make us do it that way, then okay, we'll put in this minimum number of other controls, based on these trauma-based techniques. So I absolutely remember a few of those, but mostly it was not trauma-based mind control. Mostly it was base programming, where they are starting with the base DNA programming, the base software programming, the base development programming, and building on that instead of having to break that down and then rebuild.
So that was Randy Kramer telling us about different types of mind control, the trauma-based and the non-trauma-based, and how both differed in terms of who it was that applied those, and that as far as the Marine Corps was concerned, they went for that non-trauma-based mind control, which was didn't go against the natural grain of a person's subconscious belief systems, but you would use those subconscious belief systems in a way to kind of like optimize those for that person being able to excel in terms of their abilities. So that was back in 2014, and Randy was talking about how he underwent this kind of training and mind control under Operation Moonshadow as a youngster from around the age of 6. That's important, that if you get children at a young enough age, you can mind program or do the mind control without them having a large body of beliefs that kind of like act as stumbling blocks. So you get a 6-year-old and you kind of put them through this mind control, neuro-linguistic programming, you can create super soldiers. And that's what happened with Randy, and Duncan O'Finian talked about the same thing. I can't remember what he called it. It wasn't Project Moonshadow. It was a similar type program for youngsters. And others have talked about how the agencies involved in these kinds of super soldier programs typically go for young children and begin the training at 5-6 years old. So Randy, he described having spent 17 years on Mars as a super soldier, and that he was trained to fight indigenous Martians. These were insectoids and reptilians that were indigenous to Mars, or at least had lived there for many thousands of years, and Draco reptilians who were kind of more recent arrivals that were a kind of imperial race. And so there was a kind of like these skirmishes between the different factions because the Draco reptilians and the indigenous Martian reptilians didn't always see eye to eye, and the insectoids were another group. So there was fighting all around, and he said it was very much a territorial thing, that each group had its own territory. And if you were a newcomer to Mars and you want to establish a presence in a particular territory, you would run into problems with that indigenous species that were there, or the Draco reptilians. So his job as a super soldier was to fight, and that's what he did. So there are others that have talked about this. There's a Brazilian super soldier. I did an interview with a Brazilian researcher who's the author of a book, Fabio Santos, and Fabio Santos is the author, and he wrote the book Planetary Intervention about this Brazilian super soldier who also was subjected to mind control, MK Ultra type, and was also trained to fight against grey and reptilian extraterrestrials. And what was very interesting in this case was that he was part of a kind of earthwide global cadre of super soldiers that were trained specifically to fight extraterrestrials wherever the extraterrestrials wanted them to be. And this was typically in conflict zones. So if there was a conflict zone, these super soldiers would be sent there not to be belligerents in the conflict, in the war. So, for example, if they were sent to a war zone like in the Philippines, where you had the Philippine government fighting against, say, Muslim rebels in one of the breakaway provinces there in the Philippines, these super soldiers wouldn't go there to fight against the Philippine army or to fight against these Muslim rebels in those provinces of the Philippines. But in fact, they went there because all the fighting created a natural environment for these reptilians and greys to kind of like come in and do all sorts of things with the combating belligerents without there being any kind of accountability. No one would pay attention. If you have a whole battalion of soldiers suddenly disappearing in the middle of a war, then no one's going to pay attention to that. Whereas in peace times, if a battalion of soldiers suddenly disappears, it's like, well, what happened? There was 800 soldiers that were there one day and gone the next. What happened to them? So in warfare, it creates opportunities for these kinds of reptilians to come in and abduct and engage in warfare. So these super soldiers were trained by this global organization to go into these battle zones to fight against the reptilians or the grey Orions. So that's the mind control aspect. Now there's this is where we get to the second form of super soldier. This is where individuals are genetically enhanced. And one of the ways of enhancing an individual is to create a chimera. And that is where you introduce the DNA of a particular animal, whether it's a wolf, a tiger, a bear. You introduce that into human DNA, and that presumably optimizes that human who now has some of those abilities, some of those qualities of the animal whose DNA has been successfully fused into it. Now, these kinds of genetic experiments of chimera have been conducted a long time. Now, there are a number of sources that talk about this happening in Atlantis. And Edgar Cayce, as I recall, was one of those that talked about these genetic experiments happening in Atlantis, and that they were chimera there that would be part of the warfare that Atlantis engaged in. And there's a lot of parallels between Atlantis just before the Great Flood, which led to its destruction, as described by Plato in the Critias and the Timaeus, where he describes Atlantis as being an imperial global power that tried to impose its authority all around the globe, and there were wars. So we know that the Atlanteans were imperial, bent on conquest, and they had these chimera super soldiers that they engaged in the warfare. And that's not unlike, there's many similarities with the United States at the moment. And, no matter what your position on the United States is as a country, as a democracy, and I live in the United States, and I think it's a fantastic country to be in, and I love living here, and I love Americans, but I have to acknowledge that America is an imperial global power. It has hundreds of bases, I think thousands of bases all over the earth, where it imposes its authority and can bring down governments that it deems unfriendly or contrary to US imperial interests. So Atlantis went through something very similar. Now, we've had, I've interviewed two ladies who have been able to access the memories of people that lived in Atlantis prior to the Great Flood. And they talked of very similar stories of these chimera being created, and that Atlantis was very much an imperial power engaged in intent on asserting its authority all over the planet and subjugating countries or places that didn't submit to Atlantean authority or demands. So Sarah Breastman Cosme, she's written several books now, but one of her books discusses the experiences of Jen Sullivan, who I also interviewed. And both interviews you can find on exopolitics.org. Just type in those titles: Past Life Hypnotic Regression, Insights with Atlantis and Lemuria. And what both ladies have revealed is that these chimera were created in Atlantis and used for warfare. So the Atlanteans used chimera in warfare. Now, is this happening in the United States now? Well, there's a story in the Washington Post that was published in 2004, which is titled, "Of Mice, Men, and In Between, Scientists Debate Blending of Human Animal Forms." This is by Rick Weiss, and this is what he said. "Chimeras are allowing scientists to watch for the first time how nascent human cells and organs mature and interact, not in the cold isolation of laboratory dishes, but inside the bodies of living creatures." So we know that open source scientists are experimenting with chimera dating back to 2004. That's nearly 20 years ago. Now, one of the things that you can accept is that classified programs are decades ahead of open source science experiments and research when it comes to optimizing human performance or the creation of super soldiers. So if in 2004 you have the first open source experiments with animals trying to blend these different animal genetics into creating chimeras, then you can be sure that in the classified programs, decades before, 20, 30 years before, that they would have been doing the same thing, but with much more advanced technologies. So I think that this is a good, I think a very important clue that the creation of chimeras is not something just of legends that belongs to Atlantis or part of mythology of ancient Greece, because Herodotus and others described the chimera in ancient Greece and in the ancient world. So the ancients knew about these kind of human-animal hybrids and how powerful they were as warriors. That this same thing is going on now in classified laboratories. So this takes me to another kind of genetic experiment, which is these kind of enhancements, the so-called Hulk program. Now, exactly what that is, whether that's a chimera, whether it's like blending human genetics with, say, elephants or something, or rhinoceros, that I'm not sure. But there is this Hulk program. And there have been people associated with that James Rink has interviewed. He's interviewed quite a few people. James Rink has interviewed people like William Nutter, aka Johann Fritz, Michael Jaco, and a few others that talk about going through this kind of Hulk program where their physical body is genetically altered, or that their consciousness is moved into a avatar body which has been genetically altered to be like this massive warrior, literally like a Hulk. And that the goal of these super soldiers or these avatar bodies was to fight against Draco reptilians and other extraterrestrials. So this is another way in which you can have humans being genetically altered. Somehow they can have their own physical genetics altered in a way at a young age to kind of like have this kind of thing happen to them in some classified program, or maybe their consciousness can be transferred. In the case of Rink and Nutter and others, they talk about their consciousness being transferred into one of these Hulk bodies, or somehow in the programs, drugs and so some kind of technology is used to kind of physically alter the body that they are in to create this Hulk. The Marvel Studios, this isn't just imagination. It's kind of like a soft disclosure, if you like. I mentioned cloning. These super soldiers can be cloned. Now, one of the witnesses or whistleblowers who did come forward in the 1990s to talk about some of these classified programs that involve cloning of humans and the creation of super soldiers was Michael Wolff. So he wrote a book called The Catches of Heaven, which is a really awful book. If you try to read it, good luck to you. It's a very difficult book to read. You're much better off listening to his interviews. He's done interviews with a number of people. One of them is Paola Harris down here, a good friend, supporter of exopolitics. And she interviewed Michael Wolff on many occasions. And she got to interview him where he talked about some of the cloning experiments that he was involved in. And he talked about cloning a super soldier. And he described that happening in the 1970s. So, of course, the first cloning experiment, I think it was Dolly the sheep that was reported in the open source literature. That was around, I think, 2004, 2005. In fact, the cloning, the experiments in these classified programs in the United States happened in the 70s. So, again, 30 years before the open source literature starts talking about it, the classified world is already working in that arena. So Michael Wolff says that he actually was part of these initial cloning experiments, and he created a clone that was designed to be a super soldier. But he objected to the goals of the program and to what they wanted to, how they wanted to use these clones. So he programmed this particular clone to be a pacifist, not to kill. And so that infuriated the program managers, and I guess they punished Wolff in some way, and then they killed the clone. So he describes that and how upsetting that was. But yeah, he was a very interesting insider whistleblower, and he was involved in these cloning experiments. Now, they talk a little bit about the origins of cloning in Nazi Germany. Now, this is something I've discussed in a number of texts. William Tompkins talked about this in terms of his interviews, his recollections of what was happening in Nazi Germany according to the reports of Navy spies. Cloning, according to William Tompkins, had been first developed by the Antarctic Germans with the help of the draconian extraterrestrials, after the US and the Antarctic Germans had reached agreements in the mid-1950s. It's not surprising that cloning technology was adopted for use in deep black projects, which involved a high incidence of death among super soldiers fighting extraterrestrials. So the Germans achieved a lot of success in their cloning experiments back in the 40s. I mean, that's hard to believe now that genetic science can go that far, goes that far back. But of course, they had help from draconian extraterrestrials that were assisting the Germans in developing clones, because they wanted a clone army. They wanted the Germans to build a clone army for the Draco Imperial fleets. I mean, that's kind of like sounds sci-fi, but this seriously is what William Tompkins was reporting, that Navy spies were telling their superiors at these debriefings at Naval Air Station San Diego during World War II. So this was happening during the Second World War. So I continued. Using clones while preserving the original bodies in stasis chambers meant highly trained and expensive super soldiers could be used again and again in covert space warfare. So that's something that's really pretty intriguing, that if you have multiple clone bodies made of a super soldier, you can deploy those different clone bodies, because once you've mastered the technology of transferring consciousness or soul or part of a soul essence from one body into a cloned body, then that clone can go out there, do whatever it is that you command it to do, and then if that clone is killed, the extract or the soul essence of that clone goes back into the original body. Now, that sounds like science fiction. I mean, and in fact, if you saw the reboot of the Battlestar Galactica series, it actually had the Cylons, the human-looking synthetic Cylons, actually doing this, that they were clones, and if one clone was killed, it would go back to some kind of, the soul extract would go back into some redistribution center and then would go into another clone. So in fact, this is very close to the truth. Again, soft disclosure. Now, Mark Domizio, he talked about some clones that were made of him. And I've done 3 interviews with him, and he described how he was originally taken and abused at Diego Garcia. That's a naval facility in the middle of the Indian Ocean. And that then there were 2 clones made of him, one that would spend its time in Diego Garcia, so it spent 34 years in Diego Garcia, and the other clone was on Mars, And so what Mark Dimitrios says happened was that his soul extract, part of his soul essence, was put into these two clones. So when he went back to living his normal life, his civilian life, because he's only spent a couple of years in the classified program at Diego Garcia, that when he went back after 2 years and lived his normal life, part of his soul essence was siphoned off and moved into these two clones that continued to live for 34 years, and the other one on Mars lived, I think, for about 38 years. And those clones, because the soul essence isn't as strong as the full embodied soul, the soul essence could be programmed through MK Ultra to do things that the person objected to. So, for example, Mark Dimitrios says that when he went to Diego Garcia, they put him through mind control and they wanted him to become an assassin. And he said no, flat out no. And they couldn't convince him to do otherwise. So they tortured him, imprisoned him, and subjected him to all this abuse. And you can go to the interviews to hear about that. Really compelling story. But his clones that were infused with the soul extracts, because those soul extracts weren't as powerful, that meant that the mind control training succeeded. So his soul extracts were now in clones of him, and they went out there doing all of this kind of like assassination work or fighting in these wars as super soldiers. So very intriguing kind of a story that gives us a lot more insight into this whole genetic experimentation or modification program to create super soldiers in a number of ways. So this gets me to the third way in which a super soldier can be created, and this is technological enhancements. So transhumanism, we know that that's all about attaching technology to humans to optimize performance in some way. So clearly, if you want to optimize human performance and you are part of a military classified program, you're going to look at applications that technology has for optimizing soldier performance in the battlefield. So yeah, the military programs and the scientists in that are forever looking at different technologies and how they can be applied to the battlefield to modify or augment special forces in particular, so that they can be more successful on the battlefield. So transhumanism, attaching technology to soldiers, that is happening in the classified world. Now, where did this begin? We can go to 1952, and there was a scientist, a medical doctor, Dr. Andrija Puharich, and he began research into technologically enhanced psychic abilities. So he began using Faraday cages, and he wrote a paper in 1952, or several papers beginning in 1952, where he elaborated on how you could improve psychic abilities through a Faraday cage. And so he was very interested in finding technological enhancements that could be used for optimizing psychic abilities. And so when you did this, you could optimize people's ability for, say, remote viewing or kind of any kind of psychic espionage, for intelligence gathering, or to be weaponized. And I mentioned earlier Michael Ralph, a natural psychic whose psychic abilities were enhanced through mind control to become a psychic assassin. So Puharich was interested in these kind of technological enhancements that could be used for improving psychic abilities. Now, what's very interesting about Andrija Puharich was that he was also contacted by the Nine. This is a very interesting ancient group of we can call them extraterrestrials, or we can call them high dimensionals, that kind of like sit at the apex of some kind of hierarchy. And there are different cedar extraterrestrial civilizations that interact or communicate with the Nine. And earlier on, I mentioned the Anunnaki and Ea and Enki. So there is a collaboration between them. So it's very interesting how the extraterrestrial element factors into this whole endeavor to improve psychic abilities. Now, another individual that talked about technology being used to optimize psychic abilities was Charles Hall. He wrote a series of books. I think there were 5 in the series. There could be 6 now. He said that in the 1960s, he said that tall white extraterrestrials, these are not Nordics, these appear to be Orion greys. There's some kind of grey Nordic hybrid. So he described these tall white extraterrestrials sharing technology with the US Air Force, and that would electronically enhance telepathy and other psychic abilities. So he said that telepathy could be created through some kind of electronic device that a person could wear or attach to their, or use in some way, so that they could communicate with others telepathically. So telepathy and other psychic abilities can be enhanced through some kind of technology. You know, this takes us into the field of psychotronics, because if you can use technology to enhance human abilities, psychic abilities, telepathy, telekinesis, and so forth, it stands to reason that you could also use similar technology to diminish people's natural telepathic abilities and telekinetic powers and so forth. So I think psychotronics have been used for both purposes. You know, on the one hand, to enhance abilities for super soldier related programs, and on the other hand, to diminish abilities for those of us in the natural, those of us who are living out in kind of natural lives without any kind of involvement in any of these secret space programs. If we have exceptional human abilities and we stand out and we decline to join these programs, you can literally be targeted by these psychotronic weapons, and because you have above average psychic abilities, you can actually have all sorts of mental, emotional problems because you're being targeted through these psychotronic weapons, because the intelligence community doesn't want competition, or the deep state, to be more accurate, doesn't want competition. Neuralink, we've all heard about Neuralink. Clearly that leads to this kind of transhumanist project. There's a story just that happened, I think a month ago or 2 months ago, that the Food and Drug Administration in the United States finally approved Elon Musk's Neuralink chip for human trials. Have all the concerns been addressed? So Musk has been green-lighted to start conducting human experiments. Now, as I said earlier, open source science is decades behind classified research on technologically enhanced humans. So if Elon Musk is now cleared to start inserting these Neuralinks into people, and you can be sure that there are going to be individuals in classified programs are going to have these Neuralinks inserted into them with the intention of optimizing their performance for combat duties, that they want to create super soldiers. So of course for Neuralink, the argument is, well, we want to do this because we're going to help people who are suffering chronic mental illnesses or who are handicapped for some reason. That Neuralink will help them to walk again or be able to regain their mental facilities and so forth. I mean, that's a kind of warm, fuzzy reason for why this is a good thing. But behind the scenes, the classified programs, they would be jumping on this. Well, they would have jumped on this 30 years ago. You can take it to the bank that in the 1990s, they would have been starting the first classified programs with technologically enhanced super soldiers with something like this Neuralink to optimize combat performance of soldiers in the field. So we've got, so this is the research, this is some of the kind of sources that tell us a little bit about these kind of technologically enhanced individuals that can become super soldiers. We actually have individuals that have come forward to talk about that. Now, one of the individuals that has come forward to reveal her participation in one of these programs is Rebecca Rose. I interviewed her in an article on Exopolitics Today titled 20 Years as a Cyborg Super Soldier on Mars and Kuiper Belt. So that's episode, well, you can go to Exopolitics Today or exopolitics.org. I've got 2 websites. And you can find that article, that interview with Rebecca Rose. So I'm going to play a short clip where you get to hear Rebecca talk about how she was technologically modified in a secret space program to fight against extraterrestrials, and she was used in a 20-back secret space program. So here's the clip with Rebecca Rose.
You're age 9, you've been taken to Mars, and the mantids start working on you to enhance your psychic abilities, and then you're built out to be a psychic super soldier, or sorry, a cyborg super soldier. So can you just explain what happened?
Yeah, exactly. How do we explain this one to your audiences? This is always hard for even me now to wrap my head around. So we could, in simple terms, we could say a human that's built out with AI, but I would say cybernetic, a cybernetic organism, which is part tech. I mean, we were built out chemically, biologically, mechanically, psychically, et cetera, in every way built out. So, and this takes place over time. We had a lot of training, but and also these amendments to physiology that were made. And ultimately, I mean, it's hard even to describe myself as, you're still human. They want to retain your human qualities, your psychic ability, and your ability to some level, think for yourself. That was at least during my time there, it seemed so. But they definitely want to see, in a way, it's a research and development lab. Like they want to see how far they can go with a human. What can we make them do? How far can we go before the system, the biology just is corrupted and it can't be used anymore?
Okay, so Rebecca gives us a real life testimony saying that this kind of technologically enhanced human, a cyborg if you like, being used in secret space programs or being used as super soldiers, that has been happening. So as I've just gone over some of the literature that points to this kind of thing going on for going back to the 1990s, that this actually is happening, and fascinating testimony about these cyborg super soldiers. So now I move to the 4th category of super soldier that is quite different to the 3 earlier ones that I mentioned, the mind control, the genetically enhanced, and the technologically enhanced. This one is a kind of organic super soldier. These are starseed super soldiers, or individuals that have naturally high levels of gamma brainwave activity. These are individuals that have exceptional speed and intelligence that makes them ideal super soldiers. So these are people who just are starseeds, if you like. Some people can call them starseeds, but they have extraordinary mental abilities because their brain produces a high amount of gamma rays. Now, how does the brain produce high degrees of gamma rays? I'm not a specialist on that, but I imagine it has something to do with the pineal gland being triggered. That if the pineal gland is fully active, the brain is producing a lot of gamma brainwave activities where higher brain functions are activated, and incredible things can be done with high gamma brainwave levels, and I'll be talking about that. So, starseed gamma super soldiers. So, do we have any kind of examples of people that have got high gamma brainwave activity that are part of these super soldier programs? Well, there's Jean-Charles Moyen, who was part of a joint French-US secret space program, and he was a super soldier. And he describes himself as being an incarnated starseed that was recruited by this joint French-US secret space program. And he had unusual psychic abilities. The one that stood out was his ability to teleport, but not just teleport. He could also do things like he could influence lights around him, electromagnetic currents would be influenced. He had certain telekinetic powers, but the teleportation stood out. He's described multiple instances where he was able to spontaneously teleport from one place to another. And he agreed to undergo an experiment that was being conducted by Dan Winter, who encouraged Jean-Charles to purchase some equipment that would measure his brainwave activity when Jean-Charles would try to simulate him teleporting to a place. And sure enough, what this brainwave activity showed was that as he began to move his consciousness into this kind of teleportation mindset, high levels of gamma ray predominated, gamma brainwave, sorry, predominated. And so that was very, very interesting, that gamma brainwaves were associated with psychic abilities, and in particular, this ability to teleport. As Jean-Charles began to envisage the target where he would teleport to, his gamma brain waves would spike. And so this was scientifically tested and measured. So there's records showing this. So that, not only supports Jean-Charles, his testimony about his claims of having teleported spontaneously to different locations and to space arcs, and I've talked about that in previous webinars. So, that's a plug for some of the earlier webinars. I did a webinar on space arcs and several months ago, so definitely you can go to that. And I talk a little bit about Jean-Charles going to using teleportation to go to different space arcs. So teleportation, gamma brainwave activity, very significant. So teleportation, is it feasible? Well, there was a teleportation study that was conducted back in 2003. This was one of those leaked defense intelligence research documents that was released 4 or 5 years ago. This was by Eric Davis, Dr. Eric Davis, and he was very interested in studying teleportation. How feasible is teleportation? So he identified, this is what the study concluded. The author identified and proposed 2 unique physics models for teleportation that are based on the manipulation either the general relativistic space-time metric. So here we're talking about wormholes that Albert Einstein envisaged that would be possible, that the Einstein-Rosen bridge, using Einstein's theory of general relativity. If you have a sufficiently large mass or a gravitational mass, a black hole or something, that you could, in theory, establish a wormhole connecting 2 points in space-time. So that was one way in which teleportation might work. Or the space-time vacuum electromagnetic, the 0-point fluctuation parameters. So Eric Davis is going from the macro to involving very large kind of stellar bodies, black holes, and so forth, to the micro, talking about 0-point energies, where you're talking about things like at those kind of nanometers level, picometers, I think they call them, where you can have this kind of like vacuum fluctuation and energy being produced, and somehow that creating some kind of wormhole or teleportation effect. So those are 2 ways in which he proposes you can actually have teleportation. Neither of those incorporates or allows for this kind of gamma brainwave activity that I just described Jean-Charles Moyen. So I think what physicists miss here is, in looking at these kind of scientific models, whether it's quantum or Einsteinian relativism, what they're missing is this kind of human factor, that humans have this ability to create extraordinarily high levels of brainwave activity that can trigger abilities like teleportation. So, I think that's where the physicists can actually learn a little bit by paying attention to this kind of material and testimonies like Jean-Charles. There's another person that I think gives us even more of an idea of how gamma brainwaves are a trigger for the kind of like optimal human performance, abilities such as teleportation, and probably even more significantly, to be able to access and use extraterrestrial technologies.
This concludes part 1 of the June 23rd webinar titled Super Soldiers and Ascended Masters, 2 Pathways for Humanity's Emergence into a Galactic Society. In just a few days, we will continue with part 2 on this historical groundbreaking discussion, disclosure, and debate. You have been listening to Exopolitics Today with Dr. Michael Salla. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Join or start a conversation in the comments. Take the time to explore the vast library of best-selling books, webinars, and podcasts by Dr. Salla. Visit exopoliticstoday.com.